Hi, welcome back to the UK Medical Freedom Alliance. My name is Ian Humphreys, and today I'm very, very pleased to be joined by our CEO, Dr. Liz Evans, with a very special interview with journalist Sally Beck. If you don't know Sally, well, she's been reporting for 30 years now, and she really gets into deep dive information, excellent reporting. We've known about her for some time. She's very closely associated with our organisation, and we're very proud of that. So I think probably the best thing to do, rather than listen to me drivel on about all sorts of stuff, why don't we just go over and have a really good discussion with both Liz and Sally. Welcome to another broadcast by the UK Medical Freedom Alliance, the UK's most recognised and respected organisation advocating for every individual's right to informed consent, bodily autonomy and medical choice. We are the UK's voice of ethical medicine. So, Sally and Liz, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really grateful. Sally, it's really great to meet you for the first time and make your acquaintance. So thank you very much for coming on to our podcast. And I thought maybe we'd start perhaps with a potted history, I suppose, of Sally, of your history as a journalist to date. I know it's been a fair while now, so perhaps you could take us back to the beginning.
I know, I should have been retiring. That was my plan.
Shouldn't we all?
19. But thank you for inviting me. It's really lovely to be here and lovely to meet you, Ian. And Liz, I've known since 2020. And we met thanks to COVID while I was still a mainstream media journalist. I mean, I still am a mainstream media journalist, but what I want to write about doesn't seem to get too much into mainstream, and that's COVID. And I started my journalism career back in 1990. And up until 2022, I was writing all my articles for mainstream media, but there was a disconnect between mainstream media and wanting to challenge the COVID narrative. And I met Liz because we all had questions, so many questions around the vaccines, around the, lockdowns, masks, response to closing schools. We had so many questions, and we just felt that we weren't getting any answers. So we were discussing this amongst ourselves. And then Liz introduced me to the Conservative Woman, and I pitched my first idea to them back in 2021. And I was outraged that the BBC was pushing COVID vaccines to pregnant women, despite the fact that none of the vaccine manufacturers had done any studies into pregnant women. They hadn't even released the results of their reproduction toxicology studies, which I think was in 22 rats in the end, something ridiculously small.
Yeah.
So we had lots of questions. So that's how I came to be in this arena. But I first came across vaccine injury back in 1998 with the MMR and Dr. Andrew Wakefield. And up until Andrew Wakefield was struck off in 2010, I was writing about vaccine injury, specifically MMR, for mainstream media. One of those pieces included a front page for the Mail on Sunday, which I did a comment for. I wrote the comment. The story was a young lad who'd been paid 90,000 from the vaccine damage payment scheme for being injured by the MMR vaccine, but it'd taken his parents 18 years to get that paid.
Wow.
And we've seen and heard all the stories with the vaccine injured, whose vaccine injury has been confirmed, yet the vaccine damage payment scheme says you're not injured enough.
Yeah.
Okay, you need to be 60% injured for us to consider. Okay, so you might have a neurological problem, you might not be able to work anymore, but you can do a different kind of work. So we don't consider you to be 60% injured. And
So I'm just interested that you were able to get publication in the mainstream media, at a time, over the Andrew Wakefield era and the MMR sort of scandal. Did you find it was easier in those days to get something in, or did you know you were going out on a limb and you were risking your career? Like, how was that for you as a mainstream, presumably quite conventional mainstream journalist at the time? How did you did you think, oh my goodness, this is not a good idea? And were you getting pushback, or what was your experience?
The opposite, the sympathy was with the parents and the children.
Oh, wow.
And we'd already seen some fairly horrific drug abuses. I looked up the other day to see what kind of fines Pfizer have paid, and it's 11.5 billion since 2020. That's just since 2020.
Wow. And they'd done a lot before that, hadn't they?
Yeah.
There was a lot more before that. And also the Merck and others were also fined, weren't they? There's a whole raft of them. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was a lot of questioning of pharmaceuticals in mainstream media. And I think the drug companies realized that this could be really serious for them, because with vaccines, what you're doing is giving someone healthy an intervention that's supposed to keep them healthy. It's not supposed to make them sick or compromise their health in any way. And especially when it came to children, obviously, newspaper editors, features editors, news editors, they all have children, and they're all taking their children to be vaccinated. So they absolutely wanted to know if there was a problem. But what was interesting was after an article was published, so I think I wrote something about a study that Wakefield was doing in monkeys. So they were giving them the childhood vaccine schedule to see how that affected baby monkeys. And that was published in the Mail on Sunday. And then within a very short space of time, there were articles counteracting, and this became a pattern. So you'd get a negative article into mainstream, and very soon it would be counteracted. And nothing was clearer, actually. After Andrew Wakefield was struck off, things changed hugely. So it was very, very, very important that he was struck off to change the narrative in mainstream media. That was really important. And then the story I was telling you about the lad, Robert Fletcher, his name was. His mum is Jackie Fletcher, who started Jabs, which is an information site about vaccines. But anyway, their story was the front page of the Mail on Sunday. I wrote the comment for that. On the Monday, The Guardian was saying the MMR story that will not die. That was the headline, or words to that effect. And the Guardian was saying, despite the fact that Andrew Wakefield has been struck off, they're still trying to push this narrative that there's something wrong with the MMR. But, a vaccine damage payment scheme payout.
They'd awarded it.
They'd awarded it, and it's absolutely legitimate to talk about, why was it awarded, and all the issues surrounding that. So
did you feel at that stage that the Guardian was somehow there was some vested interest behind the scenes starting? Because obviously we had the whole Brian Deere thing as well, didn't we? Was he a journalist?
Yes, Brian Deere was the Sunday Times. So James Murdoch was on the board of Glaxo, and Glaxo manufacture one of the MMR manufacturers. So the Sunday and weirdly, Brian Deere had done some negative stories on pharmaceuticals. So he'd been exposing Big Pharma, and I can't remember the stories that he exposed. But he got a phone call asking him to find something big on the MMR. And I'm assuming, I don't know, but if you're joining dots, it would make sense that James Murdoch had something to do with that. And
So it
so,
feels, yeah, I was going to say, so it feels like over the last 30 years, there's been quite a shift that the media has sort of been, it was realized that that was a weak link for the pharmaceutical industry because you were able to get stories out because there was a fair, debate going on.
yeah,
Because obviously the BBC were the ones who hosted the press conference with Wakefield, weren't they? So I mean, that was back in the day that was considered. We obviously talk about these things, and what a massive change you've then experienced over your time reporting this.
it's been a huge change. But having said that, I think that you have to jump over higher hurdles. But mainstream media reported narcolepsy from the swine flu vaccine. They have reported some HPV cases. They have been reporting COVID vaccine injuries, particularly the Mail and the Telegraph. Sadly, I mean, Ben Goldacre, I don't know the history. So Ben Goldacre is the science editor at The Guardian. Now, I think his father, who is a doctor, had something to do with the introduction of the MMR. I don't know that. The person who would know all that is a lawyer called Clifford Miller, who I'm sure you've come across. He knows the history to Ben Goldacre much better than me. But we have had stories in mainstream media. So the minute countries were suspending the AstraZeneca vaccine, for example, that was routinely reported. But we haven't really got to the bottom of, do vaccines do more harm than good? And I think that will take Bobby Kennedy to come up with his studies before we can report that. And the truth about, we don't actually know, because there's no vax versus unvax studies official. Any studies that there have been are epidemiological studies, and Andrew Wakefield described those studies to me. Well, they're the same studies that they use to dismiss smoking causes cancer. So easy to manipulate. And what's never been reported is that Andrew Wakefield's case study series was then replicated across 11 other universities. I can't tell you off the top of my head which universities they were, but I know that the week before his hearing came to a conclusion at the GMC, and I wrote a double-page spread for the Mail on Sunday about what it had been like living through this investigation and what his hopes were for the future, I wasn't able to keep in the section that 11 other universities had replicated his study.
Wow.
And the reason, because we as journalists, we weren't qualified to say whether these were good quality studies or not.
Right.
I do feel that we should have kept that in. I really feel we should have kept that in, but we didn't. So
Take you back to the report. Sorry, just taking you back to the reporting side of it earlier, when you said that some of the newspapers were reporting some of these stories. Is there a possibility they did that because then they could, well, it gives them almost like a plausible deniability if they were given the allegation that they were heavily down on one side. And so that they could.
No, I mean, my years in journalism, we absolutely relished getting stories like that, where we could expose. I mean, look at Harold Evans and how he exposed thalidomide. It took him 10 years, but he told his journalists, do whatever you need to do. And there was absolutely that feeling across journalism. The minute you heard something like that could be harmful to British citizens, we would go for it, and we absolutely did. So there wasn't what changed. The Science for Media Centre actually changed. And I went to 2 press conferences at the Science for Media Centre, which is heavily funded by Big Pharma. And that was set up after the Wakefield paper, or after all those stories came out about MMR. And I went to 2 of the press conferences, and I was really challenging. I can't remember what the title of the press conference was, but it was something to do with vaccination. And I was really challenging those on the podium, but none of the other journalists were. And that is because the Science for Media Centre was set up to feed stories to journalists, and you couldn't have a foot in both camps. So you couldn't criticise what was being fed to you without being taken off the list of getting press releases and being invited to press conferences. And I was never invited back ever after that.
So it's quite a stitch up there. The whole system then became very stitched up to be more of a propaganda piece for Big Pharma and the vested interest. But even sort of having said that, were you surprised? So in those first few months of COVID, as you said at the beginning,
please consider donating to the UKMFA. We are really grateful for all donations, no matter how small. Your donations enable us to continue to lobby for your right to informed consent and medical freedom to be upheld, and to provide resources to educate and empower the public. There are multiple options for donating. One is that you can scan the QR code that's on this video right now, or you can go to the link that is featured in the description below this video, or you can go onto our website and contribute via donor box, or you can buy us a coffee.
Were you shocked about how little or almost none was in the mainstream media? Was that on a whole nother level, would you say?
Well, there were 2 reasons for that, as far as I know, and whether you consider them right or wrong, I think they're pretty solid reasons. So number 1 is journalists, our code of practice, we are not allowed to start a panic. That's very high up in our panic. So if we're challenging the narrative during that time, on what grounds are we challenging? And would it, if we challenge it, would that cause a panic? Number 2, once people were locked down, newspaper sales plummeted because people weren't buying papers on the way into work. And the government took out a huge advertising campaign with the newspapers promoting COVID, let's say, put it that way. First rule of newspapers, don't piss off your advertisers. So there was those 2 things, but I tried to get round that by pitching a story. One of the first ones I pitched was, I think we should do something to let people know how their immune system works, how their innate and adaptive immune system works, because there's so much fear. We're just ramping up the fear. This will help people to realize what their body can do to defend them. No one was interested. Okay, so I was talking to Paul Marek about his vitamin C protocol, and Paul Marek was at East Virginia University. Liz, can you remember his title? He was in charge of critical care or something like.
Yeah, it was emergency medicine, I think.
Emergency medicine. He was the head of that department. And people who were being admitted with severe COVID, they were testing their vitamin C levels and finding that they were so low on vitamin C that they could be diagnosed with scurvy. He was giving them, amongst a steroid protocol, 26 grams of intravenous vitamin C, which we use to fight infection and the cytokine storm. And his patients were walking out. They weren't dying. So that was that was a really significant story, and I pitched that. I couldn't get that in. Others did get in about vitamin D. I was commissioned by the Daily Mail back in April, I think it was April, May 21. It was the first death that I'd come across from somebody who died after receiving the AstraZeneca vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
And I was commissioned to do that story, and it coincided with 18 countries suspending AstraZeneca. So it was absolutely newsworthy. But what happened was the family in question, there was lots of toing and froing. Did they want to do this story? Didn't they want to do this story? By the time they decided they did want to do this story, the story was getting a little bit old. And newspapers are about news. It's got to be new. So we slightly missed the boat on that, slightly. I still think they could have published that story. It did get published in the end, but it wasn't my story. I think it was published in the Daily Star, but it didn't get into the Daily Mail. And after that, I pretty much decided that I just needed to spend full time on these stories. I did get stories in after that. There was an amazing story that the Mail did on the harsh reality of lockdown and care homes and how that affected our elderly people. And, you know, the before and after photographs were absolutely horrendous.
Yeah.
And I also did a story on Dr. Sam White. You know, he was one of the first doctors to speak out, and I'm sure he's been struck off since he first spoke out. But at the time, his legal team were upholding his side of the story, and that was being upheld, and that was reported in the Daily Mail. And that was the kind of last time that I pitched. And the reason I stopped pitching is because my gut feeling was telling me these stories are going to get turned down. People are going to stop opening your pitches. They're going to stop reading your emails because, you know, for whatever reason, these stories aren't going to get in. So just stop pitching. So I did.
Yeah. So you're banging your head against a brick wall, basically.
Yeah, exactly. But the tide has turned now, has definitely turned. And I feel more comfortable going to mainstream media with these stories again. So watch the space.
I mean, you've done some amazing work. I mean, during COVID, you were just prolific at, you know, highlighting really early issues with the vaccines, the plight of the vaccine injured. You had the pilot stories, obviously the pregnant women, which was an ethical abomination, excess deaths. You know, there was so much to report on, wasn't there? And, you know, you were all over it. And of course, the MHRA, I think you did quite a lot trying to hold them to account.
Yes, and I still am. And Liz, I cannot believe. So now we have these freedom of information reports that show that 6 out of 10 of the top 10 most injurious batches of COVID vaccine belong to AstraZeneca. And last month, I wrote to the MHRA saying 6 out of 10 of the most injurious batches of COVID vaccines are AstraZeneca. Can you explain that to me? And they wrote back and they said, we did everything right. We tested all these batches. We tested quality control. We're not seeing a problem. They literally said that.
Wow. But they're not looking at like the data which they've got, or the injury data connected with the number of the batch. So that's not relevant.
Yes, 6 out of 10. This is heavily, you know, we had Johnson & Johnson, we had Moderna, we had Pfizer, we had AstraZeneca. It's Pfizer and AstraZeneca who were in the top 10, and that's probably to do with, for Pfizer, numbers, but certainly not for AstraZeneca.
No.
Certainly. So I went back to them and I said, well, look, what's your best explanation for the fact that 6 out of 10 of the most injurious vaccines are AstraZeneca? And they said, we feel we answered you in the last email. And, you know, it's stonewalling all the time, literally all the time with the MHRA. The worst one, there was some amazing Indian doctor who discovered that in the World Health Organization handbook on vaccine rollout, if you have 2 adverse events from the same medical procedure, or in the same area, or in the same clinic, or in the same town, you should halt the program and investigate thoroughly.
Wow.
And it's right there in the World Health Organization handbook. I sent that to the MHRA. They never, ever answered that question. Never. They answered pretty much all my other questions, but they would not answer that question.
I mean, how are we ever going to hold? Do you think we will ever hold them to account, the MHRA, because they are slippery, aren't they? And
They
you
are.
know, we got into dialogue with them, and you are banging your head against a brick wall. I know Cheryl Granger's done amazing work, actually, hasn't she? I don't know if you've or her the freedom of information request, the pregnancy, but it just feels like, how do we actually go from, you know, presenting with them with the evidence that there's a massive problem and them actually doing anything about it?
Well, Andrew Bridgen sums that up quite nicely, I think, the MP, former Conservative MP, Andrew Bridgen, who's fought tirelessly for the vaccine injured and, you know, lost his whole career over it. And he said that a senior cabinet member came to him and said, we can't do this now, we'll do it in 20 years. And that's how these things work. So look how far away we are from thalidomide. And that's still not really resolved. Look how far we are away from the blood, HIV blood scandal. And, you know, it is set up to hope that people will give up. And in the case of the vaccine injured, they hope they will die and go away. They really do. And some will.
And of course, by the time any justice is served, the people who were responsible are long gone. I think that's the other thing, isn't it? It's like, you know, with the infected blood, how many people who were responsible for that are still even around now?
Exactly.
Yeah, no, it's really depressing, but I think, you know, and I'm sure as a journalist you would agree, we still have to keep getting the truth out there, though, don't we? Because it is the truth that will save other people from, you know, ending up in the same position of being a victim of these massive corporate sort of injury, which is going on.
Well,
the problem is, though, isn't it? These organisations are making the truth up as they go along. So this whole phrase of this is, you know, my truth or our truth, you know, that's what they're relying upon. They're changing definitions as they go along. And that's making it very difficult to say that something doesn't fit into a certain definition, because they've changed it overnight without any consultation. And they say, well, no, we've done that and that's fine now. And so that's now what we're going to stick with, which is what they did with the definition of a vaccine, for example.
Well, all of that and changing criteria here, there and everywhere. And the first red flag was when the Pfizer study was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and the author didn't have access to the safety data. They were basically writing that on the back of a press release from Pfizer.
Right.
And we saw that where, was it Naomi Wolf or Aaron Siri? It might have been Del Bigtree and ICANN. They were petitioning to get access to the Pfizer safety data, and they were told, yeah, you can have it. It'll take 75 years.
Yes.
I asked the MHRA for access to that safety data, and they came back to me and they said, it's not in the public interest and it's commercially sensitive.
Wow.
Well, the second one is probably more key, the fact that they're financed by the people they're rubber stamping.
Exactly. But how can it not be in the public interest?
Of course. And actually, is there any appetite in the mainstream media to report on the amazing work that Naomi Wolf and her team have been doing on the actual Pfizer data? Like, we have those millions of pages now, and they've done some fantastic reports and analysis, and it's absolutely horrific what is in there in the, in the manufacturer's own trial data. Why is this not even being reported in the mainstream?
I honestly, I don't know. I would just be guessing. But I do know from, people I've known for 30 odd years and who I've worked with for 30 odd years, they were 100% sold on the narrative. They all got their vaccines. If I talk to it's interesting when you see the Mail, it's the Mail online who are doing all the vaccine injury stories. It's not the main paper.
Mm-hmm.
So they're kind of in competition with each other, which I don't think people appreciate. And I did message.
I think that's also true of things like GB News, isn't it? For example, and other organisations like that, they get round the control by having their online presence. So they run side by side, but they seem to be completely at odds with each other, which is why Neil Oliver can make stuff on GB News Originals and Bev Turner can do things on GB News Originals, but not on GB News.
And that's, entirely how it's always been. So you have, on the one side, you have our authorities, and we're reporting on those stories. And on the other side, we have, well, this has gone wrong, and this is because of the authorities, and we're reporting on that side. So we've seen that the Telegraph has reported on the MHRA and their failings.
Please sign up to receive our newsletter, and you'll be notified of UK MFA campaigns, open letters, calls to action, and any important updates. You can do this on our website at ukmedfreedom.org. That's ukmedfreedom.org.
You have to always think as a journalist, if we end up in court, will these witnesses and will this evidence stand up in court? And that's how you have to think as a journalist all the time. What is my evidence for this? I've got these amazing anecdotes and case studies, but they're considered hearsay until a doctor or a study or a court case agrees with that victim, yes, you were injured by the vaccination. So ditto with the way the trials were run, and the way the trials were reported. Okay, what is the evidence apart from somebody disagreeing that actually they didn't follow procedure? And and of course that's extremely important that we have that high level of evidence, but frustrating as well.
And would pharma come off? Sorry, would pharma come after you, sort of to sue you because you're damaging their commercial interests over a product? For example, if you report on an injury, is that now a risk that journalists are under?
The history is that pharma generally don't sue newspapers, as far as I know, because mostly they're in the wrong. And, unless it was some kind of obvious, really obvious. So let's take statins, for example, and Ozempic. Pharma hasn't sued over statins or Ozempic, because they know they don't really have a leg to stand on.
Yeah, and you've been covering Ozempic because I'm quite interested. I mean, I know your interest is much broader than COVID. You seem to go down all the medical ethics issues, but Ozempic is a real worry. I mean, I know you've been writing some articles. So what's your take on what's going on? This sort of sudden sort of desire to jab everyone in sight with another injection, and this time it's going to stop them actually wanting to eat.
Well, yes, and at the beginning of COVID, I had a very interesting conversation with a journalist about patents. And she had been working on somebody's biography from the pharmaceutical industry. And they talked to her about patents. And I don't know how long it is before a drug patent runs out. Maybe it's 10 years. I don't know.
I think it's 10, yeah.
once those patents run out and your drugs go off label, like ivermectin and paracetamol, and anybody and everybody can make them, you need the next blockbuster drugs. So, and what I heard, and I didn't actually do this investigation, but I heard that the drug companies were running out of patents and running out of blockbuster drugs. And they're all public limited companies. They all have shareholders. They have to keep up the profit for the shareholders. So that's why the COVID vaccines were so important to Big Pharma, so important, because they made huge profits for pharma. Pharma used to like to say the vaccines didn't really make them any money. Actually, that's not true. And they were very important drugs. Ozempic is a hugely important drug. It's a blockbuster drug. Statins, the same. So in the US, and what we've seen is this revolving door where the industry creates a market. So they'll give you a vaccine that gives you an injury. Then you go to your doctor who gives you a drug that helps you with that injury. So they're kind of, that it's a sort of revolving door, isn't it? For the patient. And with Ozempic, what we've seen is that you start taking the Ozempic, then you need the anti-nausea meds because it makes you feel sick. And then, what other issues is it causing? So you need meds for that. So,
and also it's a medication for life, isn't it? Because I think this is what they're really keen to say, because the minute you stop it, apparently the weight piles back on. So once you've managed to lose weight, your whole gut physiology has been completely irreversibly, in some cases, damaged. So then you're going to have to keep taking it. I mean, and I think this is what this business model seems to be at the moment, that pharma wants to be giving all their drugs to as many healthy people as possible. This is what we see with the statins, the criteria widen and widen and widen. And, isn't that great for shareholders? Because that is your profit getting bigger and bigger and bigger on the same drug. And it feels like Ozempic's, if you can get some teenagers taking Ozempic, that could be weekly injections forever. I mean, it's madness.
What you're saying very, very delicately is that the pharmaceutical industry is there to keep us sick in order to keep them profitable.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
I'd love to know when that flipped. I mean, we need, I don't know who would be able to tell us that. Maybe Suzanne Humphreys and Roman Bristink, I think you pronounce his name. They wrote Dissolving Illusions. But Suzanne Humphreys has done some amazing research into the history of vaccines and how it all began. But Ozempic is, apart from the fact the weight goes back on, the weight you've lost is bone mass and
muscle as well, I think.
Muscle mass. And I think I very briefly caught a story yesterday in the Mail saying that our arms look like string or something. I can't even remember what the headline was because I haven't read the story, but it was in the Mail yesterday, the potential harms, and the Mail have been very good on the potential harms of Ozempic.
But you can already see the push, can't you? Because, initially that I know that it started in America earlier, didn't it? And there's already class actions going on. But then about a year ago, we suddenly get this this drug could be a game changer. It could literally treat everything and reduce dementia or whatever. It had some outlandish claims. And you read the article and you think, but where's the mention of the class actions going on in America? Because surely that's a relevant fact in a piece of journalism. So this is not journalism. This is, you've basically writing a press release for the drug company. And that's all you're doing. You're not even saying, obviously, there is a little bit of concern about this and there is a class action in the States. But, we've now found out that there's this study. There's not even, you're not getting both sides of the debate in a lot of these articles. And you see then how the pharmaceutical industry seems to be able to put their stories on the headlines, in all the papers at the same time. Because I remember this happened last year, I think. I'm going, why have you not mentioned the class actions I knew about already? So, it's not beyond the wit of most people to find that out.
No, exactly. So I imagine that was a Science for Media Centre press release that went out to everyone, to all the news desks. And what you do if you work in newspapers, is you talk to your colleagues, and you agree, how you're going to approach a particular story. And that's mainly so you don't get a bollocking from the news editor because you've missed something. So, that's a sort of what goes on the inside. But what was really interesting, so ITV did a whole piece on Ozempic, and they were basically blaming these appalling reactions that people were having on people who were buying Ozempic from online pharmacies and not getting prescriptions. Yet when you looked at, the most horrific side effect is thyroid cancer that you can get from Ozempic. But when you look at the public information leaflet and the leaflet that they give to doctors, all the side effects that people were complaining about, some people had collapsed, the nausea, the horrendous, Lottie Moss, Kate Moss's sister, had a seizure. They were blaming it not on the drug. They were blaming
it.
Yeah. Even though they were all in the public information leaflet, and ITV did not highlight that. And that was a huge red flag for me as a journalist, and a huge failing. And the fact that these deaths have been reported to the MHRA and to the US drug
FDA.
FDA.
I mean, I think you can see already how this story is going to play out, and in 20 years' time, it's going to be a massive scandal, and it's going to be, how did we let this happen, and how did we market this to young people, and or because it's not just the absolutely clinically obese now, is it? It's become a lifestyle drug. I was reading someone in the paper today talking about I think it was Jeremy Clarkson's on it. He was talking about he didn't get on well with Ozempic at all. It made him quite sick, but now he's on Mounjaro, which is better. But he said, well, basically, we've got a real issue now, because he says, I can eat literally a tiny sort of half a starter size meal and I'm full. And this is a real problem if you go to a restaurant, because, how are you going to have a starter, main course and dinner? So there was a call for restaurants to start producing micro meals for people who are on these drugs, so they could have a mouthful of each course and they'd be done. And you think, what are we doing to ourselves? And it's like, and yet these are hugely lucrative drugs. This is a massive multi-billion, probably trillion industry, isn't it? And yet we just fall for it every time, this, because none of us are suffering from a deficiency of Ozempic.
No, and in the US, children as young as 6 are being prescribed it, and I think what's the name of the drug company? Novo Nordisk. They're investing $4 billion into a manufacturing plant in the US.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you caught this weekend. There's all sorts of rumors about a sex scandal and Bobby Kennedy. But they will be looking to totally discredit Bobby Kennedy, because he wants, he said the most sensible thing that anyone in health has said. He said, look, we could be giving everybody 3 organic meals a day for the price that would cost us to invest in Ozempic.
Yeah.
And so it's no surprise. They will come at him with everything they've got. Big Food and Big Pharma, because he's in both of their eye lines.
Yeah, because basically these people are suffering from ultra processed food, and nutritional deficiencies. This is nothing to do with, needing their gut motility to be slowed. And basically you end up in a malnourished state. It's starvation. This is not healthy weight loss. This is very, and apparently you get some sort of Ozempic face, which actually is extremely aging. And so now people are having to have fillers, you know, to sort of, so because they've sort of gained 20 years by going on Ozempic and losing weight because they look gaunt and sick. You know,
well, and also they're being prescribed the wrong diet. So
yeah.
Jeremy Clarkson has been prescribed a low-fat diet, and
disaster.
he's been put on statins. And, you know, I think it was 2 years ago, I flipped my diet to a high-fat, low-carb, low grains, no dairy, no gluten, no sugar diet, because I was diagnosed with a thyroid issue, and I lost over 1 stone in weight effortlessly. I have to say, you know, the detox and the insomnia that went along with that was pretty horrible. And I understand how you might want a quick fix, but that quick fix is going to cause you more long-term problems. So better to go through the pain barrier sooner rather than later, because you're going to have to do it at some point.
And presumably, do you now feel you've got more energy and actually you feel healthier and more kind of vitality?
Yeah, I mean, I had a lot of energy anyway. You know, most people are complaining that they're suffering from fatigue. I have the opposite problem, which, you know, at my age, you would think it would be fatigue was my problem. But, you know, I have tons of energy, and I have problem burning it off.
And
I've just started down the same route myself, actually, and I have to say there's been marked improvements in just general health. Skin's better, you know, just feel a bit more alive, and
and teeth. You know, no one cutting out gluten, cutting out dairy, gone are the sinus issues. Your teeth don't feel furred up anymore. If you've got catarrh, that all goes.
I've had lots of people around me as well have been sick recently, and I haven't picked anything up, which is unusual for me. Usually I'm the first one to go down, but no, I just haven't. So it's definitely a positive thing. Absolutely.
Yeah,
and I think a lot of people don't realize actually what really true good health feels like. I think a lot of people are walking around with suboptimal energy, you know, sort of low-grade symptoms, aches and pains and digestive issues, and just don't realize that that's not normal, and that just by changing your diet, you know, suddenly you think clearer, your guts work normally, you know, you don't have bad breath, or there's so many things, aren't there, which are just people put up with and don't understand, and a drug is not the answer. Because that doesn't change any of that.
That should have been what the government were then putting out then. So when all of these illnesses which came about started to circulate, that was the advice they should have been given, not go and get some pharmaceutical intervention that hasn't been tested. And that brings me back then, I suppose, again to journalism. I mean, do you feel that some of your fellow journalists have let us down?
Is it the journalists or is it the editors? I don't know. I mean, you know, journalists are in the same situation as doctors. They've got mortgages to pay, they've got kids in school. You know,
I mean, I feel very let down by. I'm a former policeman, so I feel very let down by the police service. I feel very let down by the medics, and I feel very let down by journalists, in particular TV journalists. I think more than actually the newspaper journalists, to be honest. But I think it felt to me, and please, you know, put me right on this if I'm wrong, but I felt like the TV journalists were just reporting what they were told to report, but they weren't actually investigating anything. So the investigative journalism seemed to not be there.
I agree. And I think we saw that very clearly. There was a press release from the NHS about unvaccinated pregnant women ending up in intensive care with lung issues. And when we dissected that, Liz, you and I and somebody else from UK MFA, we dissected that press release, and when you got into it, what they'd failed to mention was that if pregnant women end up in intensive care before COVID, it's mostly because of lung issues. They've contracted pneumonia or something like that. When you boiled it down, the numbers had been made to look way worse than they actually were.
Yeah.
And all mainstream media just regurgitated that press release, and that was really disappointing.
Yeah. So it's losing the critical thinking, isn't it? And accepting authority. I think it's the acceptance of authority. If an authority figure, this is a bit like protocol driven medicine. It's like, well, somebody wrote this protocol, this must be okay, even if it sounds a bit weird. And that sort of takes us on to midazolam and morphine and all the end of life stuff, which I know you've also been covering, and which it has just been an absolute scandal. Because what seems to have happened, certainly during COVID, people were being put on respiratory depressants because it was a protocol. It was the NG163, wasn't it? The NICE guideline. And not engaging their brain and saying, well, hang on, I've got somebody who's struggling to breathe here. If I give them morphine and midazolam, that's going to make things worse. You never give an opioid to somebody with a lung infection. And yet that all of their common sense and clinical training was thrown out the window, and they just followed these guidelines.
You can find the UK Medical Freedom Alliance in most social media locations, in particular Facebook, on X, YouTube, Spotify, and of course Apple Podcasts, and our favoured location of all, Rumble, which is the home of free speech. You'll also find us in the mainstream media and of course the alternative media too. Remember to like, subscribe and follow at every opportunity, and you'll be notified when our next broadcast is becoming available.
Now, what's your take on how pervasive that was and how much it inflated the death figures?
I've only come to midazolam recently because of the Derek Dimmock case. So Jackie Devoy is a journalist who's done a lot of research, and Ash Mahmood, they've done a lot of research. And when I first started hearing those stories about people going into hospital and being put on this end of life pathway, I just can't believe that. But I've heard it now from so many different quarters and so many different types of families, and people going into hospital for so many different things. And now, by the way, they don't call it NG163. It's called the gold standard protocol.
Oh gosh, I didn't know that, because I know it was changed to 191. So it's now just a gold standard.
Now it's gold standard, yeah. It's called gold standard. So
and that also includes taking away fluid and food, doesn't it?
Yes.
Which I think is so evil. Like, to actually dehydrate somebody and starve them to death. It's so unpleasant to be dehydrated. So I don't remember ever doing that when, that was 30 years ago or 25 years ago when I was doing medicine. But, we used to give subcut fluids, to somebody who was dying, just to give their body a little bit under the skin, that it would get absorbed so that they didn't dehydrate to death.
Yes,
was this part of this case? So tell us a bit about this.
Let me tell you about the Derek Dimmock case. So it's not straightforward. And so where we are in the trial, so we've had 5-day inquest hearing so far, and it overran. So we haven't heard from the families, the witnesses supporting the family. So all we've heard from so far is the witnesses supporting Royal Trinity Hospice in Clapham, which is where Derek Dimmock died. Now, he had many comorbidities. He had congestive heart failure. He'd had 3 stents and a pacemaker. He had anemia. He'd been treated. He was 86 years old. I don't know if I said that. He'd been treated for skin cancer. And I think there's no doubt that his health was failing and he was coming to the end of his life. And in fact, he'd had respite care. So he was admitted to the hospice in June, but he'd had respite care there in the January. He'd been there for 5 weeks. He'd recovered and he left and he went home. But his health was declining again. He was becoming agitated, but the ambulance service who were called, because the family had called over a period of days saying, we think he's coming to the end of his life. We think he's coming to the end of his life. And I think what they wanted to say is, we think he needs more respite care. But they actually said, we think he's coming to the end of his life. His GP was called. His GP allegedly didn't examine him. And his GP is now off sick with, signed off with, I guess it's stress, but he has some kind of psychiatric long-term sabbatical. The GP who took his place was retiring that day, the GP from his surgery. His notes went missing. He died and all his notes went missing. The hospice barrister suggested that the family had taken the notes. That's the suggestion. But the notes did reappear, and she said that they were given to the hospice from the family's solicitor. Well, we didn't hear how the family solicitor got the notes. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what's going on there. But it does seem that, Liz, you will know this is better. If it's coming up to a weekend, they put together in place a package of drugs that you collect from the pharmacy that are kept with the patient. And that package of drugs included midazolam, morphine, and oxycodone, which, as we know, is the banned drug OxyContin. It's an extremely powerful drug. And that package of drugs was put in place and went with him, I think, to the hospice.
That's the just in case, they call it, just in case drugs. A lot of people got put on that, just in case, but then it puts that decision in the hands of the hospice then, doesn't it? It's like it's up to their discretion. They can use it if they think appropriate.
Yeah. And this was June 2020. It was June 2020. So it was during the lockdown period that all this was going on, and before the vaccine. And then midazolam wasn't a controlled drug. So you didn't need 2 people to sign off if it was going to be put in a syringe driver. His syringe driver was also faulty. And they're saying, well, it doesn't actually matter if it was faulty, because we can tell how much of the drug he was administered, and it was fine. He wasn't, these drugs did not kill him. But his wife noticed a huge change in him immediately. He'd been talking in the ambulance. The ambulance service had given him a drink of water, some gas and air to control his pain. They didn't, it's not clear what was causing his pain. He'd been prescribed gout medication, which he'd only had, I think he'd only taken it once. So it wasn't clear whether he had gallstones that were causing his pain. It wasn't clear what was causing his pain, but he said he felt like he had a knife in his back. He was also quite incoherent, but very lucid. The London ambulance service said he was lucid, and he was able to go to the hospital in a non-emergency ambulance. But very quickly after arriving at the hospice, he seemed to go into a coma, and then the following day he died. So we're just trying to get to the bottom of, was he really at end of life, or was his death hastened? So that case is...
And the family believe it was because they've pushed for the inquest. I mean, they've pushed quite a long time for that inquest then, presumably 5 years, that is nearly.
Well, and they had 5 pre-inquest hearings. So presumably a lot of this evidence was heard to determine whether it should go to a full inquest, and to give a 5-day hearing is quite serious. So I can't see at the moment exactly the evidence that made the senior coroner decide that it should go to that inquest, to be perfectly honest. And the other journalist, the 2 journalists in court, Majid Nawaz, Jackie Devoy, Rachel Roberts and I from the Epoch Times, and online, me for the Conservative Woman and News Uncut. Rachel and I have both come to the same conclusion. Look, there's no clear-cut case here yet. These are the red flags. These staff seem to be very caring, but there was a hot mic moment where one of the senior doctor that night had given evidence via Zoom. She turned her camera off, but she didn't turn her mic off. And we assume it was the lawyer, don't know. Said, "Are you okay?" Because it was quite a long testimony. She said, "Yes, I think I deserve a bottle of gin." Then they both started laughing. And she said, "Thank goodness you're paying me enough to be here," or words to that effect. And then, the court said, doctor,
we can hear you.
You need to switch your mic off. We can hear you. And then she came back into the court and apologized if any of her remarks had caused offense. She realized that these were sober proceedings and she didn't want to do anything to undermine them.
Yeah, she must have been mortified. But there was talk that there seemed to be some hostility towards the family, and there was questions around bias. Did you pick up on that at all?
Straight away, immediately. So the senior coroner was irritated with the family's KC right from the get-go. Every time the barrister asked a question, James Bogle asked a question, there was irritation. Amanda Wright Kluger is acting for the hospice, and she seemed to get very favorable. He clearly favored her. I mean, she's a attractive blonde, in 40-something attractive blonde. James Bogle's probably in his 50s, and comes across as slightly bungling a little bit. But if I hadn't seen it in other scenarios, I would have thought, oh, he's just annoyed with him because he's not as organized as he could have been. But I've seen this before. So I saw it at the High Court, Liz, when they were trying to stop, when they wanted a judicial review to see whether the COVID vaccine should be given to 12 to 15-year-olds.
Children's, yeah.
And Francis Hoare was in line for that kind of criticism from the judge, or irritation from the judge. And also when they were trying to challenge the mandate for care workers. But I also, and we saw it at the COVID inquiry as well, didn't we?
Yes, definitely.
100%.
But I've also saw it right back when I went to my first inquest, and it was an inquest into an 18-month-old baby, George Fisher. And his parents said he died 10 days after his MMR vaccination. And I went to that inquest, and the coroner was really irritated with the family's legal representation. So, now this is beyond coincidence. And this seems like what's happening is there's a hostile environment being created towards anyone who challenges medication.
The narrative, So the establishment narrative is more important than anything else, and they all close ranks around it. And I wonder if that's because a lot of people would say, is there some corruption? Is there money changing hands? But is it actually just an ideology that these people have bought into, that they want to protect the establishment, and they see that their role is really to do that because they're part of it. And then the narrative, so it's that sense of, well, it's the greater good, because if we allow this case to, throw any doubt on this really important sort of sacred cow, then lots more harm could happen. So, it's accepting the sacrifice of the individual. I just wonder if that's the ideology rather than just, lots of people being paid off, and which would be another way that people might interpret that.
It feels like it. And also, I don't think, coroners can be immune to the fact that, so in Georgie's case, there were 5 lawyers there for Merck. I think it was Merck.
Whoa, that's intimidating.
It was intimidating. And there was this, family, the best that the family could afford, who clearly was struggling to understand all the issues. But the lawyers, I can't remember if it was Glaxo or Merck, but it would have been one of the two. They just had this huge folder of stuff, and every page they said, you should not give Calpol to children who've had an MMR vaccine if they develop a fever. They repeated it. And obviously that's what your GP tells you as a parent.
I know, and the poor mum, how she would then feel. Yeah, that's devastating. It's pushing blame onto everybody else, because they've usually, in the small print, they have usually covered their backs on most things, haven't they?
Yes, and we saw that with the AstraZeneca group action, didn't we? So I think it was about 25 people had to drop out of that because AstraZeneca had put in rare cases, I think that was in the April, cases people could develop blood clots. So anyone who got the vaccination after April and
they should have read the small print. Yeah. Wow. Shocking. Ian, have you got any more questions? So I'm aware that we've taken up a lot of Sally's time.
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's been everything's been so well covered. All I can say is I thought my world was on its head, but I think you've just turned it another little notch, to be honest.
I'm so sorry.
No, it's a wicked world, isn't it? But on the other hand, we've got to keep smiling and keep pushing on and living life. I think is the best way to push back on all of this, because lead your best life, because I don't know what we're going to do about a lot of these things. I think it's going to trickle out slowly, the information. It's probably what the newspapers were worried about, and in terms of if all the information comes out at once, the psychological hit on people can, I would imagine, be very heavy. So I think it will come out.
We'll find that out a bit more. But I'm an optimist, Ian, and I like to see this period of time as a period of opportunity. I think Big Pharma's overplayed its hand, which is opening the way for functional medicine doctors like Liz and for alternative health to raise its head. And so, I'm not naive enough to think that we're going to bring down Big Pharma, but I do think that we are capable of building new ways of dealing with health for those people who want preventative, for those people who don't want to be on drugs for life. And I'll just give you one very quick example. Okay. So a family member has been suffering with fatigue, nausea, vomiting, migraines, and weight loss. The NHS prescribed propranolol, which is a beta blocker, which basically is saying, oh, you're anxious about something. That's why you've got all these symptoms. But Liz, you know that those symptoms are a sign of magnesium deficiency. They're classic signs.
Yeah.
And this family even had, it had been identified by the National Migraine Centre that for migraines, you should treat them with magnesium, CoQ10 and B2. Now, we had somebody here who works in A&E, a doctor, emergency doctor, and we were just, talking, and she said, we use magnesium all the time in A&E. I went, what? She said, we're putting it in inhalers when people have asthma attacks. We're putting it in people's drips to lower their blood pressure.
Brilliant.
And I just went, whoa, I didn't know that at all. So that to me, and this is somebody who's also had the jabs, was sold on the narrative, possibly a bit more awake now because her partner would never go down that road. But to hear that from an A&E doctor, that was really interesting.
That's really encouraging, because I think in the end, these also, we're going bankrupt ourselves. We cannot afford a massively polypharmacy, every person on goodness knows how many drugs. That's just not a sustainable system. We'll have to go back to the basics, and 150 years ago there were no pharmaceuticals, and actually people managed health with things that were grown in the garden, with good food, herbs, talking to people, putting your hands on people, touch, all of these things actually are free. And I think we can do a lot to improve people's well-being and health just with those things, and keep the drugs for the the sort of important things, because there is a place for pharmaceuticals, but they're trying to take over the whole thing, and I just don't think it's it doesn't work.
No, and it must be a violation of a Monopolies Commission violation. But as we see, the more money pharma makes, the more they can buy their way into our institutions, and the more they can control them. So, that's really what we should be focusing on, really drilling down into that. Actually, how have they controlled the NHS? How?
Yeah, definitely. Brilliant.
Anyway,
thank you so much, Sally.
Yeah.
It's been just lovely to talk to you, honestly, and you've doing such amazing work, and it's been such a joy to have known you this long, and the fact that you were kind of part of that initial UKMFA meetup, and then that's been
and the work that you've done, Liz, has been amazing, and continue to do with UKMFA and Heart. So yes, thank you so much for that.